So I want to talk about a lesser-known 2020 presidential contender, and that person is Julian Castro. Now, he has not been on my radar. In fact, I don't really think he's been on anyone's radar because up until this point, he's done nothing to differentiate himself from a field of candidates that all kind of bring something unique to the table. So, for example, Andrew Yang, he's bringing universal basic income to the table. We have Tulsi Gabbard talking about a strong progressive foreign policy position. We have Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren being economic populists. But when it comes to Julian Castro, it's very clear that he doesn't really offer anything unique. But as we learn more about him, we're not necessarily learning more about his policy positions, but we are learning that he is someone who is a political opportunist. And he made that clear in an interview where he decided to throw not just one progressive, but two progressives under a bus in order to propel his own candidacy. Now, the individuals who he decided to throw under a bus are Bernie Sanders and Ilhan Omar. So first, I want to talk about what he says about Ilhan Omar. He's going to target her specifically, someone who already is a target of harassment and abuse because of her identity, but he's going to pile on and say that what she did was in fact anti-Semitic and accuse her of doing something that she's not actually guilty of.
Well, I was glad that she apologized. I don't believe that she's, in her heart an anti-Semite, but I do believe that those comments gave life to some old tropes, biases against Jews as having dual loyalties or somehow, dominating industries or politics with money. And so I was glad that she apologized. I'm also glad that the House is condemning bigotry. We've seen a rise in anti-Semitism over the last couple of years. We've also seen a rise in, anti-Muslim hate and hate directed at others. But yeah, I'm glad that she apologized. I do think that, it's fair whether the country is Israel or a European country or a Latin American country for people to criticize or to pick apart the policy that the United States is taking toward that country. Mm-hmm. But it should be done, I think, in a constructive way. And not in a way that gives rise to old tropes.
So to me, hearing him say that, it demonstrates that he is a spineless coward because rather than standing up for her, he chose to do what everyone else did. He chose to do what's politically expedient, and he chose to throw her under a bus. He says that her comments, quote, gave life to some old tropes. But he kind of contradicts himself towards the end there because he says, look, it's not completely unreasonable to criticize Israel and specifically criticize America's relationship with Israel, but the way that she did it, it just wasn't constructive. Okay, well, if you're going to say that, then you actually need to be specific. Because when I hear what she says, I think that that is in fact a legitimate criticism. So if you're saying that criticism of Israel is acceptable, albeit in a very specific way, then you need to cite some examples and not just be a political coward and say what everyone else is saying. Oh, well, what she did was anti-Semitic. Well, then how do you criticize Israel? How do you navigate this topic while not being anti-Semitic? You gotta give us your ideas. And I understand that he had limited time in that short interview, but you can't just smear someone effectively and then explain that they're anti-Semitic while not giving us an example as to how she specifically went wrong and how she could improve and actually criticize Israel in a constructive way. And we know we're not going to get that example from Julian Castro because this is someone who is an establishment politician who would go along with the status quo on this particular issue. He would not criticize Israel. We know that because back in 2012 at a lunch event with AIPAC, he basically already swore allegiance to AIPAC and talked about how wonderful they are because they help facilitate this strong relationship between the United States and Israel.
Work that AIPAC has done and is doing, and the reason that we're here today as well. The third thing I learned was how important Israel is to that region and to the United States. Obviously democratic, a country that shares the values of the United States and is a beacon of hope in the Middle East, and very importantly, a great diplomatic friend to the United States, and one that we have every interest in supporting. Here at home, AIPAC has been essential in maintaining that very strong connection, those ties, and ensuring that in Congress, that in state legislatures, and even in local municipalities, that elected officials, policymakers, decision makers understand the importance of the relationship between the United States and Israel. I return willing and ready to be supportive of maintaining that very strong tie between our country and Israel, and encouraging others to go to Israel, to learn about it. I look forward, hopefully at some point in the not too distant future, getting back to Israel and learning more about the country, because as relatively small as the nation is, we certainly didn't get to see and learn everything that we could have, and so I look forward to returning in the future.
So as Julian Castro says all of this wonderful things about Israel and ignores the fact that they are carrying out a literal apartheid right now against Palestinians, I just wonder if Julian Castro is criticizing Ilhan Omar because he genuinely believes that she breathed new life into old anti-Semitic tropes, or if it's because he got the orders from AIPAC, seeing that he's a shill for AIPAC. Now, he also took shots at Bernie Sanders when it comes to the issue of reparations. Now, I've actually been critical of Bernie Sanders because I don't think Bernie Sanders is up to par when it comes to reparations. Nobody really is, to be clear, but he criticizes Bernie Sanders in a way that is unacceptable in my view, because what he's doing is he's trying to say, Bernie, you need to improve, but it's hypocritical because he's not looking in the mirror. He's saying Bernie should support something that he himself doesn't support. I'm not even kidding about this. And he admits this as he criticizes Bernie.
What do you mean? Do you think that there should be actual monetary payments to descendants of slaves? Do you support more like what Senator Sanders is talking about, policies such as child care and education that help those who are disadvantaged?
Well, you know, what I said was that that I've long believed that this country should address slavery, the original sin of slavery, including by looking at reparations. And if I'm president, then I'm going to appoint a commission or task force to determine the best way to do that. There's a tremendous amount of disagreement on how we would do that. But let me just say something about Senator Sanders' response there, because he was also asked this question in 2016. Mm-hmm. What he said on The View, I think, the other day was that he didn't think the best way to address this was for the United States to write a check. To my mind, that may or may not be the best way to address it. However, it's interesting to me that when it comes to Medicare for all, health care, you know, the response there has been, we need to write a big check. That when it comes to tuition-free or debt-free college, the answer has been, we need to write a big check. And so if the issue is compensating the descendants of slaves, I don't think that the argument about writing a big check ought to be the argument that you make if you're making an argument that a big check needs to be written for a whole bunch of other stuff.
Interesting.
So if under the Constitution we compensate people because we take their property, why wouldn't you compensate people who actually were property?
Does Julian Castro have the credibility to actually use this line of attack against Bernie Sanders? Absolutely not. Because let's take a moment to really look at his argument. He is essentially saying that there's kind of this double standard with regard to Bernie Sanders and reparations, because when it comes to other issues like healthcare and education, he is very idealistic. But when it comes to reparations, then suddenly he's a pragmatist. So what gives? Now, what he is saying essentially is he's basically regurgitating Ta-Nehisi Coates' argument, and I believe that Ta-Nehisi Coates made an argument that is actually persuasive, but Ta-Nehisi Coates can make this argument because he actually does support reparations, whereas Julian Castro supports a task force. Wow, how bold of you. Again, let me be clear here. I'm not saying that Bernie Sanders is above criticism, and we'll talk about this a little bit more towards the end of the video. I do think Bernie Sanders needs to improve when it comes to this issue, but Julian Castro cannot make this argument, at least if he wants to make it from a position of authority, because unless you're going to explicitly support reparations, then you can't criticize anyone else for this, because it's obvious that what he's doing is he's trying to exploit this issue in order to attack Bernie Sanders, in order to propel himself, and it's obvious he just wants to placate individuals who genuinely do support reparations, which I think is actually wrong. I think that if you're not going to support reparations, then just say it. But you can't take whatever milquetoast approach you have and say, oh, well, I support reparations. Let's throw that label on there. You can't do that if you want to come off as a good faith actor. But what he's doing here is he's trying to outflank Bernie on an issue when really he doesn't have the credibility to do that. You can't outflank someone if you're not as good on this issue as the person you're criticizing. Now, let's say, hypothetically speaking, that Tulsi Gabbard wanted to outflank Bernie on this issue and say, look, I've co-sponsored H.R. 40. I've taken it a step further than Bernie Sanders because I support the legislation that John Conyers introduced for decades, which would have the U.S. government commission a study on the impact of reparations as well as how logistically it would work, who would qualify, who wouldn't qualify, things that we need to get answers to if we actually do want to move towards a tangible thing for American descendants of slavery. She can say that. Julian Castro cannot. And if Bernie Sanders is genuinely outflanked, then I would have no choice as a supporter of Sanders to concede and say, all right, well, on this issue, even if I support Bernie overall, he's not the best on this issue. You've outflanked him from his left. Kudos to you. But Julian doesn't get to do that. Tulsi could, but Julian cannot. Now, there's other issues. Kirsten Gillibrand, for example, she explicitly said she supports abolishing ICE. Bernie Sanders has not. Now, has he made some progress and maybe hinted that he might be open to it? Sure, but he still isn't as good on this particular issue as Kirsten Gillibrand. So in the event, hypothetically, she came out and said, look, what gives, Bernie? I support abolishing ICE, but you don't. I would have no choice as a Sanders supporter but to concede. Now, there's a political strategy that actually is effective in trying to target your opponent's weaknesses. And if somebody is a progressive champion, then sure, what do? It makes sense to try to outflank them from the left wherever you can. This is exactly what Hillary Clinton did back in 2016 with regard to gun control. Now, she's arguably better on gun control. I don't necessarily know that that's true. But I mean, she really exploited that presumed weakness and tried to target Bernie there and outflank him on maybe the only issue that she could. But the difference between Tulsi and Kirsten Gillibrand and Hillary Clinton here doing that and trying to outflank Bernie is that there actually was a case to be made that they outflanked Bernie, or that they could outflank Bernie. With Julian Castro, he actually admitted that, well, maybe Bernie Sanders' approach will be, the better approach. Now, I'll give him credit in saying that Julian Castro has not ruled out a check, but do I believe that he actually is going to issue a check to American descendants of slavery? No, because he's already showing signs of weakness. It's kind of like Medicare for All. The minute they start to back down, and they're no longer unequivocally saying they support Medicare for All, you know that they're not going to deliver Medicare for All, and the same is true here. So what Julian Castro is doing here is hypocritical. He's criticizing someone for not being good enough on an issue that he himself is not good enough on. Now, with that being said, I want to stress here that I'm not against criticisms of candidates who I support. If you're going to be critical of Bernie Sanders here, then I think that that's fine. Bernie Sanders is not above criticism just because I'm supporting him. And I've been critical of Tulsi Gabbard. I'm very critical of Elizabeth Warren. I'm critical of Andrew Yang. And I'm also critical of Bernie Sanders. So addressing the very specific issue of Bernie Sanders and reparations in a vacuum, does he need to improve? Yes, he does need to improve. Putting what Julian Castro said aside, Bernie Sanders himself needs to actually do better on this issue, because he is the most popular politician in America, and he shifted the Overton window when it comes to issues like Medicare for All and free college. So I have no doubts on my mind that if he came out swinging on reparations, he could unilaterally shift the Overton window to the left, which is why I think that criticisms of Sanders on this issue by good faith actors is actually necessary, because he actually has the power and influence to change minds and hearts on this issue, because admittedly, it's not a very popular issue yet. But that's why you make the case. And if we have someone like Bernie Sanders make a moral and a legal case for reparations, I think that that really can it can do a lot. It can go a long way. So I think that as progressives, we need to not try to be blind here and say, oh, well, just stop talking about this issue. Because no, I think that we need to improve here. We need to be good allies and listen to American descendants of slavery who are making a very powerful case for reparations. And if you want to hear from them and not a white dude telling you why we should support reparations, then go to ADOS101.com. But let me just say this. So when it comes to slaves generations ago who were never compensated for their labor, even if they're no longer around, well, I do think you can make the legal and moral argument that their descendants, the descendants of slavery, are still entitled to that legal debt that the United States government owes. We're not saying that white people have to pay black people. We're saying the government owes a debt to American descendants of slavery, especially considering that slavery haunts American political institutions to this very day, that black people are still disadvantaged in every conceivable way in comparison with their white counterparts. So if Americans nowadays, if they do a job and they're able to sue for the labor that they weren't paid for and get a cash settlement, why can't American descendants of slaves do the same thing and sue the American government for unpaid labor that, even if it was generations ago, they still are entitled to, especially considering that historically this is what we've done. I mean, when you sue someone for wronging you, you get a payment. During World War II, we sent Japanese Americans to internment camps, and then in 1988, Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act into law and compensated them $20,000 each. So the argument that's being made is that, well, if we've done this before historically, why can't we do this now? Why is it unique that American descendants of slavery, they don't get that, but everyone else does? And there's no answer to that because they deserve reparations. And you have to understand that, of course, it's the case that the establishment is currently weaponizing this issue in order to beat down Bernie Sanders. If you don't recognize that, then you're not politically savvy. But at the same time, Bernie's got to be more savvy. He's got to acknowledge that this is what the establishment is going to do, and he's got to come out ahead of them and say, look, maybe it's been the case that I was wrong on this issue, but I think he's probably going to be defensive on this because the establishment is clearly using this issue and exploiting this issue to beat him down. And individuals like Julian Castro are trying to do that, not necessarily because they genuinely care about reparations, because he hasn't said a thing about reparations until he was asked about it on the route, and he saw how the establishment used him being supposedly for it against Sanders. So now he's just exploiting that perceived weakness in Bernie Sanders. But with that being said, I think that Bernie Sanders should actually consider supporting reparations, because if he did, he actually would help, I believe, move the needle when it comes to public opinion on this issue. So is it the case that people like Julian Castro are making this reparations argument specifically to attack Bernie, and they're making this in bad faith? Absolutely. You've got to acknowledge that. And this is someone who's a political opportunist who's trying to step on everyone else's head in order to reach the top. But with that being said, criticism is important in order to get candidates to improve. So Bernie Sanders is not above criticism. But getting back to Castro, this is someone who has attacked two progressives in the span of 1 week, Ilhan Omar and Bernie Sanders, when he would be better served to actually propose something that would excite people rather than trying to attack other individuals. Now, part of the strategy in DC is that if you are not polling very well, which he's not, then the way that you can elevate yourself and get more name recognition is you attack the front runner. That's what he's doing. That's exactly what he's doing. But here's what I will say to you, Julian Castro. If you care about issues, then actually be bold and propose something yourself. If you're going to make reparations your go-to issue, I would love that, because I think that this needs to be part of the national conversation, but you don't get to be smug and disingenuous, and you're not better. Nobody in this race, with the exception of Tulsi and maybe Marianne Williamson, are actually better on this issue. Nobody but them.
You could support the Humanist Report at patreon.com/Humanist Report. But trust me, I'd have way more supporters on Patreon if that was my podcast. Sad.